Good morning and welcome to the FEMA Region 2 Individual and Community Preparedness Webinar Series. My name is Catherine Gonzalez and I'm a Capacity Building and Preparedness Specialist for the FEMA Region 2 Caribbean Area Office. I'm going to provide a few technical considerations before we begin. Today's proceedings are being recorded and captioned. The archived event will be available on the FEMA website in the coming weeks. You should hear your audio through the computer speakers. So please ensure your volume is turned up and so you may hear the proceedings accordingly. In the top right corner, we ask if you would like to receive news updates from Region 2. If so, please enter your email address and we'll be sure to add you to the distribution list. We will have a questions and answers session after the presentation concludes. You'll see a Q&A pod in the lower right-hand corner. Please feel free to submit your questions about the subject matters there. And time pertaining, we'll do our best to answer them. Finally, the PowerPoint presentation from today will be available for you to download in the file SharePod as a PDF. You can click on the file and download it using the download button. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the Region 2 Community Preparedness Liaison, Ms. Allison Albright, to introduce our speaker and today's proceedings.
Thank you, Catherine. Did you know that FEMA's #1 goal in our strategic plan is to build a culture of preparedness? The Region 2 Individual and Community Preparedness Program is focused on preparing individuals and communities for disasters by providing useful information and training, inspiring people to act and be ready for any emergency. Good morning. My name is Allison Albright, and I'm the Regional Preparedness Liaison for FEMA Region 2. On behalf of our team working to strengthen preparedness across New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands, I'd like to welcome you to our Preparedness webinar series. As a part of that goal, we're pleased to be hosting today's webinar on important considerations for inclusive emergency management. Betzaida, Ramirez, and Myrainne from MAVI and the Puerto Rico Core Advisory Groups will provide strategies for identifying where emergency plans typically fall short for people with disabilities, and will provide strategies on how to make emergency plans more inclusive for everyone. Betzaida Ramos has a master's degree in social work and a bachelor's degree in accounting. She has over 20 years experience working with marginalized populations, including children, adolescents, and adults with disabilities. During the past 7 years, she has been the executive director of MAVI, the largest independent living center in the Caribbean that provides services to more than 2,000 people with disabilities annually. Since Hurricane Maria, Mrs. Ramos has been actively participating in emergency response, recovery, and mitigation efforts in Puerto Rico through her participation in diverse groups. Currently, she is the leader of the Puerto Rico Core Advisory Group Steering Committee, and she's a founding member of the Puerto Rico Community Disability Relief Network, a member of the Red Cross Task Force, and a member of the Puerto Rico Voluntary Groups After Disasters. She is actively training individuals, communities, and emergency responders on inclusive emergency planning for disasters. Ms. Myrainne has a Juris Doctor and a bachelor's degree in political science and over 15 years of experience working for the community of people with disabilities and the for-profit and nonprofit organizations that offer them services. After the onslaught of Hurricane Maria, Ms. Roa joined forces with leading organizations that serve the population with disabilities to bring attention to state and federal agencies of the needs of people with disabilities. She's a founding member of the Puerto Rico Disability Community Relief Network and is currently collaborating with the MAVI for training individuals, communities, and emergency personnel in inclusive planning during disasters. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers for today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm trying to find myself in the system to turn on my camera. So there we go. Thank you. So let me turn on my camera so you can. There we go. Can you see me, guys? Good.
Yes.
So thank you. So hi, everyone. My name is Myrainne, and I am going to give you the presentation today regarding strategies for an inclusive emergency plan for people with disabilities. The objective of this workshop is to first, we are going to divide this workshop in two. The second one is going to be offered in April. We're going to be planning it and notifying you guys so you can join us again. The first part of the workshop is going to talk about you're going to learn about the key concepts of emergency planning for people with disabilities. You're going to develop sensitivity towards people with disabilities. You're going to learn the impact that disaster have on people with disabilities. You're going to recognize the areas where emergency plans fail. And you are going to recognize the importance of the individual preparedness. During the second workshop that we're going to offer further in April, you are going to learn about the important aspects to consider for inclusive emergency planning. You're also going to learn the laws that protect people with disabilities. You're going to know more about them. You're going to become aware of the consequences of non-inclusive emergency planning. And we're going to help you determine future actions for your agencies, your communities, or your families. So this is always, we want to start always with something to think about. And we think that disasters are always inclusive. Response and recovery are not unless we plan for it. This is a quote from June Isaacson-Kales. So you have to remember that we need to include people with disabilities for the planning of emergency preparedness. So first we want to learn we want to give you the definition of people with disabilities. We're going to help you identify people with disabilities for your planning. People with disabilities are people who are substantially limited in one or more of life's major activities that have a history of a disability or are perceived by others as having a disability. The examples of major life activities that are being affected by this disability are, for example, taking care of yourself, communicating, eating, seeing, hearing, walking, learning, concentrating, or even working. So you can acquire a disability from birth, at birth, or from a life event such as an accident or an illness. So we also have to consider in the community the people with developmental disabilities. People with developmental disabilities, people with developmental disabilities are people that have a long-term severe impairment that is affected cognitive ability, physical function, or both. They manifest before the age of 22 and is expected to continue throughout their life. And it also impacts three or more areas of the three or more major life activities, of the major life activities that I read in the previous slide. So if you have any questions regarding this specific definitions of people with disabilities, we would like for you to give us any questions that you have right now so we can continue to the next slide. So the next slide is about people with access and functional needs. This group is also considered when we are planning for an emergency. So people with access and functional needs are people that need assistance or accommodation, whether temporary or permanent, as they are limited in taking action in an emergency. So these people that are limited in taking action during an emergency, we have a list that are people with physical, developmental, and intellectual disabilities, as we said before, people with chronic health conditions or injuries, individuals with limited language or communication skills, elderly people, children, people with low income, the homeless, people that are dependent on transportation, and pregnant women. So this group of people, people with disabilities, people with developmental disabilities, and people with access and functional needs are the people that we need to consider when we are planning for an emergency, and that we need to be aware of where they are during the emergency and after the emergency. So how do we get to know people with disabilities? So what we need to know is that there are different types of disabilities. There are physical disabilities, there are mental and emotional disabilities, there are cognitive disabilities, sensory that include auditory and visual. There are multiple disabilities that include one or more of those disabilities, and most of those disabilities are not visible. So we also have to know that people with disabilities have to share with you sometimes that they have a disability and that they need to be accounted for as a person with disability when you are planning. So this is a matter of how people describe themselves.
Yeah, and I wanted to add on to what Myrainne had said previously. So you're seeing these different definitions, and these are terms, and we present these terms because when you're looking at emergency plans across the nation or across the world, you might see the term people with disabilities. You might see the term people with developmental disabilities. You might see the term people with functional diversity or people with access and functional needs. The key here is to understand that the broader of these terms, the term which encompasses more people, is usually the term access and functional needs, because it includes people with disabilities, it includes people with developmental disabilities, functional disabilities. So when planning, we have to make sure that each and every one of these people, that each and every one of these different types of disabilities are accounted for in your emergency plans. So emergency plans are traditionally geared towards people that are able-bodied, people that can walk, people that can talk, people that can think for themselves. So what we're trying to get to this here is that when you're preparing your emergency plans, think about the person that can't speak for themselves. Think about the person that's blind. Think about the person that's deaf. Think about the person with an intellectual disability. Each and every one of these needs need to be considered and accounted for in each of the action steps that go into the emergency plan. That's why it's important to put these concepts into the beginning of the presentation right now.
So, go ahead. So thank you, Betzaida. Let's continue. So let's go for the next slide. So in everyday life, people with disabilities actually face numerous of obstacles in accessing health, education, employment, and transportation services. So those obstacles come from inadequate policies and regulations, access difficulties, negative attitudes of people that are offering the services that people with disabilities receive, lack of information and communication. We have a lot of that. We had issues during the emergency that during Maria, we had the problem that we had a community of deaf people that didn't know that a hurricane was coming. They couldn't prepare for it, and they had no information of what was happening while the hurricane was hitting the island. So there is a problem with insufficient funds for supplies and services, and there is and I believe it's one of the major ones, the lack of participation of people with disabilities in the decisions that affect their lives, among others. So we need to have people with disabilities involved in the planning of their services or whatever their needs are. We need to have people with disabilities not only planning for emergency management, but also participating in the creation of laws, in the creation of services, in everything that is going to be offered for them, because they are the ones that know best what is needed for them. And here in Puerto Rico, we need to start promoting this more. And that is what we're trying to do with this type of presentation of this workshop. We're trying to promote the participation of people with disabilities in all aspects of community life. So how disasters impact people with disabilities? It is important to take into account that there are particular needs of the population before, during, and after an emergency. At each stage of a disaster: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. So when we are planning, we need to take into account all of those needs that are completely different from people that are don't have a disability. So in any type of emergency, people with disabilities are more vulnerable and forgotten. They have higher risks of morbidity and mortality in this situation. And according to the United Nations, children and people with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to be harmed or killed during a disaster during lack of planning, accessibility, or accommodation. So after a disaster, people with disabilities, if we don't plan accordingly, correctly, and in favor of people with disabilities, if we don't plan where they are going to be during the emergency, if we don't plan what they're going to do if we have problems with water or electricity, if we don't plan how they're going to address those issues, after the disaster, people with disabilities are more likely to end up in hospitals, homes for the elderly, and or institutions because they cannot return home. So we have a person with disability that goes to a shelter, and after this emergency, he finds out that his home is not well enough to be for him to move back. So if he doesn't have a plan for that situation, it is more likely that he ends up in an institution, because we do still have those here in Puerto Rico, sadly, or in a hospital, than coming back home or going back to a family member if he has a family member. So that is why we need to be it is very important to plan ahead so they have an idea of what they're going if something happens.
Yeah,
so,
and I wanted, I'm sorry, and I wanted to add on to Myrainne that the fact that not returning to the home, oftentimes people with disabilities are going to be institutionalized directly. They won't be sent to a shelter because most of the shelters are not adapted and readily available to see to all their needs. So this higher risk of institutionalization occurs at the immediate onset of a disaster when many people with disabilities are displaced directly to group homes, to different types of institutions. And once they get in, oftentimes they lose contact with their family members or they lose track of where they were sent to. And oftentimes most of these people with disabilities will remain in the institution after the disaster and oftentimes will not return at home at all, which is why there is so much resistance during emergencies for people with disabilities to evacuate. When the evacuation procedures come along, you'll see there's a higher resistance level of people with disabilities to actually evacuate because of this very large fear and oftentimes well-founded fear that they won't go back home. So this is a big issue for people with disabilities during disasters, and they have reason to fear it because
many examples have proven that this has happened in the past throughout the nation.
Exactly. So why and how to plan? That is very important. So the reason that we need to plan, the most important is, of course, for the health and life of people with disabilities. But in Puerto Rico, it is estimated that 20% of the population are people with disabilities. And approximately, the numbers went up, 20% of the current population are elderly people. So this represents almost half of the population, of the current population of Puerto Rico, that are either that have a disability or are elderly. So how are we not going to plan for half of the population during an emergency? We need to be sure to include people with disabilities in our agencies, in the agencies that work with people with disabilities in our planning processes. We need to have them on the table, and that is what we're trying to promote. We need to have them on the table, telling us what their needs are, telling us how we are to address those needs better, because they need we need to have their input in the process. So we also need to rehearse our emergency plans. And if we don't have people with disabilities in our communities or in our agencies, in our organizations, we need to ask for an organization like MAVI to help us do these drills and do these rehearsals. They are MAVI is more than willing to bring their people with disabilities, the people that they serve, to participate in your rehearsals, to give you information. MAVI is also more than willing to evaluate your emergency plans and tell you how they can be better, how they can consider how you can add more information or more planning for people with disabilities. And you need to also make sure that you collaborate. You have collaborative agreements with communities, with agencies, with nonprofits, with churches, so they can assist you in planning response and recovery processes. The people that were working to help people with disabilities during this process know that everything was everything. The first response were us, was community, was organizations, was people with disabilities, was our neighbor. So we need to plan, because we have lived it. We need to plan to be our first responders. We are our first responders. Our neighbor, our community, our church, our organizations that are our community organizations, those are the first responders. And those are the ones who need to have a very good emergency plan so we can help the people around us. We learned this during Maria, that first responders were the people that were next to us. And after a couple of days, probably 4 or 5 days, then we started to see an organized response from the state government. So that is why we need to be very organized, because we are the first responders. So emergencies cause more people to join the group of people with disabilities, as we know, due to an injury acquired during the emergency, or how their health deteriorates during the emergency. So because of the lack of care, lack of power for the medical assisted equipment, they also get mental or psychological issues. because of the emergency of the stress, and because of the collapse of the support and structures for the preventative health services. So that is another reason that we need to plan ahead. And to avoid major repercussions, we must be able to identify people with disabilities before, during, and after the emergency. As I said before, we need to know where they are going, where they were during the emergency, and if there are major issues with the services, power, electricity, their home, we need to know where they're going. They need to plan to where they're going, and we need to help them plan for where they're going. So what are the areas that traditionally fail during the emergency planning? So we have a list of the areas that traditionally fail, and that are the registries. We don't know where the people are. Even in our community, there are some people that know that someone at the end of the street has a disability, but they don't know what type of disability is. They don't know what type of services they need, of medical equipment they need. They have no information. So we need a registry to identify people, and we also need to identify the type of disability that they have, and the kind of services that they're going to need before, during, and after the emergency. We need to have a better notification process. As I said before, during the emergency, a lot of deaf people weren't aware of what was going on and didn't have any information of what was going to happen, where the services were, when they could go to get water, where they can go to get food. They didn't have any information. As we all know, here in Puerto Rico, all communications were down. We only had, I think, 2 major radio stations that were working. And if you are deaf, you cannot hear what's going on. So they were completely without any information. Some of them couldn't go out to get any help. So we have to plan for this to not happen again. We also have to have evacuation plans made. If we don't evacuate people early, soon, correctly, we're going to have issues too, and people are going to die. We need to have better shelters, better shelter administrations. We have to have accessible shelters. We have to have more accessible shelters. We have to have more spaces, more so they can access services. There is also the issue of lack of replacement of durable and medical equipment. We had a lot of problem with that. A lot of equipment that was damaged during the emergency. A lot of equipment that needed power to work. A lot of, and we had to wait weeks for equipment to get to the island. So this was a big issue too. And as I said, we had the problem of the lack of effective communication. If we don't have the correct information, we won't be able to pass it on, and we won't be able to help people with disabilities. Betsy.
Yeah, so as Myrainne has pointed out, and she's given you excellent examples of what happened in Puerto Rico, our experience with Hurricane Maria. But the fact of the matter is that these are areas where emergency plans fail all across the nation, all across the world. This is data we've gathered not only from Puerto Rico, but from U.S. and worldwide. And these are the areas that we need to look at more closely. As Myrainne said at the beginning of this workshop, we're just telling you what the areas are. In the second part of this training, we're going to go into different strategies that we recommend that different states, agencies implement so that these areas that are known facts where they fail do not happen again. So when speaking of evacuations, we're going to talk about how we can evacuate people with mobility issues from high-risers, from multi-floor apartment buildings. We're going to talk about how we should approach people with mental disabilities when you're trying to evacuate and they're resisting, that they don't want to leave their homes. When talking about registries, what are the recommendations nowadays as to how registries should be carried out? What are the different technologies that you can use with those registries? And in the absence of technologies, what are some manual procedures that you can use? When talking about shelters, not just what an accessible shelter looks like, but also look at what the staff in accessible shelters should be trained in, what information they should know and have, because the shelter goes beyond just the physical facilities. It also includes the staff that work within the shelters. And when we're talking about effective communication, how should we approach people with different types of disabilities to ensure that they get the information they need to make decisions and decide what they want to do? So how are we going to communicate with a deaf person? What can we do to help a blind person? How are we going to communicate with a person with an intellectual disability? So these are all areas that we're going to be looking into more detail in the second part of the workshop, which we hope you guys will all join in. So, and like we said, what we're showing you here are ways in which emergency plans tend to fail with regard to agencies. Now, Myrainne is going to talk about the individual aspects of emergency preparedness and what happens and what can be done on an individual level when preparing for an emergency.
Thank you, Betsy. So MAVI, with the help of MAVI, has created and has translated in Spanish a disaster preparedness and management binder for people, a manual for people with disabilities. So this manual was originally created by the Wisconsin Association of the Deaf and later was adapted by the Wisconsin Council of Physical Disabilities. So we, in collaboration with both of them, we were granted the authorization to use it and translate it. So we can give this training, we can give it to the community, we can give it to the agencies that are planning, we can give it to individuals with disabilities that are planning, so they can use it during their emergency preparedness. So this handbook serves as a resource for everyone, including people with all types of disabilities, and it helps them to prepare and to be safe before, during, and after a disaster. The binder contains information on each of the planning processes. So it contains a general checklist that helps people with disabilities know what they need to do before the emergency, what they need to have, what they need to be aware of before the emergency, how to prepare their go back, how to make sure they have all the documents and everything ready for the emergency. It also has a checklist of the important documents that you need to have, any extra prescriptions, any documentation, the personal documents, and all the information that they need to have, and they need to have it safe with them in case of an emergency. It has a disability checklist. It helps you identify where are your areas that are affected by your disability. This helps you to communicate to other people what are your needs, what are your disabilities, how they need to help you addressing those disabilities in case you have an issue communicating, in case you are so stressed, your also mentally stressed or that you can't communicate correctly. This also helps people with disabilities help with that. The manual has a car checklist also, what you need to have in your car, what you need to do with your transportation beforehand, how you can plan for it. And it also has the family emergency planning form. You can plan for your family, you can plan for your family member with a disability, but you also need to plan for all your family. Where are you going to be? How you're going to address the emergency? Where you're going to go? So this gives you questions and for you to do or give you ideas of what to do, and then you can do a checklist every time you do whatever task needs to be done before the emergency. So the manual also contains a medical emergency wallet card for your wallet. So this includes your personal data, and it also helps you to communicate what are your needs, what is your health needs, your psychological needs that you have. You can put all your emergency there. It's for your wallet. You always have your wallet with you. You have it in your purse. You have it in your pocket. So this can help you if you have to leave your home immediately and can't get your go bag with you. It also helps you while there's not an emergency. If you have an accident, if you get lost, you have your emergency wallet card inside your wallet, and anyone can help you with it. So there's also the medical information and emergency healthcare plan, where you can plan for any health care beforehand. So you can have all of the things that you need during the emergency. You can plan it for it beforehand. And there's also a list of how to prepare for a home fire escape plan. Sometimes those are the types of emergency that get us that happen by surprise, that we are not even remotely prepared for it. And this checklist helps you to plan for it, helps you to talk about it with your family, with your children, with you as an individual with disability, with your family, as to how they can help you, and as a parent or a family member of a person with disability, with your family member with a disability, so you can also plan for it. So, as I said before, there are a lot of issues with communication and information being received and offered during the emergency. The assistive medical equipment, the assistive communication equipment didn't work during the emergency. There were no batteries, there were no power. So there is also the stress and the emotional situation that goes on that some people cannot communicate. So people, when some of people that had problems or that had language communication issues, have this visual communication tool that is a card that is used. You can use it with medical professionals. You can use it with emergency responders, and it helps you communicate, and it helps the other person communicate with you also. So this tool is very important that you download it, that you use it, that you practice with it as an individual with disability, because once you have it, you can help yourself communicate better, and people understand what is that you need and how they can help you better. So that is also very important. But
Yeah, and so Myrainne just presented to you like a very, 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 very short and condensed version of what our individual training looks like. So she just showed you, right? And the reason we did this kind of hybrid training, we showed you what we talk about in the agency training, and we showed you what we talk about in the individual training. Because like Myrainne said, individual preparedness is the first step, especially for people with disabilities. We cannot rely and wait on municipal, county, state, federal agencies to come and save us, to come and help us. We are our first responders. We need to make sure that we, as people with disabilities, our family members, our neighbors, know what's going to happen in the case of an emergency and how we're going to respond. So we just presented an extract of what that individual preparedness training is like, and this is just the checklist. Besides looking at the checklist and going into detail with regard to the checklist, we'll also talk about each type of emergency and what a person with disabilities should do before and after, before, during, and after the different types of emergencies. So, and like Myrainne said, this is important. We, as people with disabilities, we need to prepare. We need to discuss our plans with our immediate support system. And these plans need to be talked about and they need to be practiced. This is especially true for people with disabilities. They won't know how to react if they have not practiced the plan beforehand. So having these little family drills, consider a family game night if you want to. Okay, today we're going to play how to evacuate in the case of a fire. And this is the case for children. This is the case for people with intellectual disabilities. Practice brings perfection. Practice allows them to prepare mentally and not enter into crisis mode once these emergencies occur. So this individual aspect of the preparing process is really important. And these checklists, and I have to give a shout out to the Wisconsin Council on Physical Disabilities. We are eternally grateful to them for allowing us to use their manual and adapt it to Spanish-speaking populations. It's an incredible tool that can really, really help people save lives. So go into that manual, look it over, check it out, and once again, join us for the second and third parts of the training because you're going to get a lot of useful information that you can use both in your personal lives and in your agencies as well.
Thank you. So we're done. As Betzaida said, we have a second part and a third part of the training prepared. This is just a very short gathering of all these important aspects of emergency planning, like a little aperitif, so for you guys to know, to understand what we're doing. We have also, in the other trainings, we go completely on each and every one of these aspects that we just give you the briefing of. So we always like to end this this training with this little information. This little part of information is that when written in Chinese, John F. Kennedy said that when written in Chinese, the word crisis is composed of two characters, one that represents danger and the other that represents the opportunity. So it is important for us to be aware that during a crisis, it is very important that we address the opportunity to fight the danger during a crisis. So we'd like to thank you for your participation during this training. We'd like to thank our collaborators, the Centers for Disaster Philanthropy, the Christopher Reeve Foundation, and all of the organizations that have worked with the Red Cross that have worked with MAVI along the way for the past 4 years, working with emergency planning. We'd like to be we like to give them thanks, and we like to continue doing our work. So we'd like to thank you guys for participating. We're very excited about the people that stayed with us during this training, and we hope that you guys are back for the second and the third part of this training that is going to be given soon in April. So I really appreciate your participation. Betsy.
And I wanted to thank you, Myrainne. Thank you for an excellent presentation. And I wanted to add on, besides these trainings that we're providing, thanks to the support that FEMA has given us and allowed us to use their platform to provide these trainings, MAVI is also going into the community in Puerto Rico. So if you have a community where you have identified that they're organized and they have a community leader, please reach out to us. We are going into communities. These trainings are completely free. We are not charging anything for them. We just want to make sure that each and every person with disability in Puerto Rico and their surrounding communities are prepared. So get your communities together, organize yourselves, call us, and we will be more than happy to go into them and provide this training for free to ensure that whenever the next disaster comes, we will be much better prepared, and there will be much less amount of lives that are lost because of the lack of adequate planning. So please get in touch with us, and we will be happy to provide the service to you. And like Myrainne said, sign up for the second training. Sign up for the individual trainings which are coming up. We're sure you're going to get a lot of very good information that can help you out in the process. So Lourdes,
and I think it's important for them to know also that the trainings are going to be offered for the time being virtually. So you can plan with the organization. We can do it whenever and wherever you want us to do it. We will be able to give you the training, the complete training, and any technical assistance that you need regarding your emergency planning, any technical assistance you need regarding how to address your when you're practicing with your plan at your agency, or you can bring your plan to us and we can evaluate it. So we are more than willing and more than happy to help you guys. Mm-hmm. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for participating, and please, please, please be here and register for the next training. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you for the great presentation in this short time. However, we are coming now to the Q&A session. Also, thank you to the audience for the questions. The first question is, how are these people made aware of the tools available to them?
You want to? So how are they aware of the tools available?
To them, yes.
We need
that was the very beginning of the presentation. That question came out.
Well, I think that the key thing is education. So all of us here on this call need to share the word of mouth, need to make people aware of this. Independent living centers, which is what we represent, need to ensure that this is a continuous educational process within all the services that we provide. Families with people with disabilities themselves need to be informed, need to be part of these different community groups, such as the core advisory groups, which we also represent here on the island. Be active. The more active you are with different types of groups, the more information you're going to have, and the more you're going to be able to help other people get that information which they so desperately will need in the case of future emergencies and disasters. So we have this information up on our webpage. We have it on our social media. And if you can share this information as well will be moving forward and helping other people with disabilities have the information and be aware of the tools that they have to better prepare for themselves.
Thank you. The next question is, many people run out of their medications. Are pharmacies capable of stepping up to help them?
Of stepping out?
Yes, stepping up. If the pharmacy is going up to provide services to people that are running out of medications when the time comes.
I think this has also to do with. I think this has also has to do with planning for it. So, with the type of emergencies that are announced beforehand. So let's be clear about this. So if we have a hurricane, if we have this type of situation, we need to plan ahead for this type of situation. We need to be aware that we need medication, and we need to go to our pharmacy and talk to them and ask them, what is your plan when this situation happens? That is why we need to plan ahead. I think it's a matter of how each pharmacy addresses the emergency, Betsy.
Mm-hmm. And each pharmacy decides on the inventory level they want to have or they can have. For example, we know in Puerto Rico we have a big limitation because their inventory taxes for merchandise that's not sold during the year. So owners oftentimes will have to pay more if they have more inventory, which will often dissuade them from not purchasing more than strictly necessary. But the bottom line is here that more than will the pharmacy be able to dispatch the medications we need is how we can help people with disabilities ensure that they have a reserve of their medications before that disaster can take place. Because like Myrainne said, there's some emergencies that we can prepare for. They're planned. We know in advance they're coming. But that's not the case with a fire, with an earthquake, with an explosion. So the key thing is, how do we as people with disabilities plan? How can I create a reserve of these medications so that once a disaster occurs, I can have a maybe 1, 2, or in the best case scenario, a 1-month supply of what my medications are so that I can ride through it until things stabilize and pharmacies start operating normal as well. So that's something we look at when we look at the individual preparedness training. We speak as to how people with disabilities can better plan and get that reserve of medications they need so they won't be so bad off when the disaster strikes.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Thank you. Also, pre-coordination with the states, right? With the state emergency management office so that they can do that with the private industry as well. The next question is, how do you track where people have gone when they are hospitalized? I think that comes through the
how do you know where people are after they hospitalized?
How do you track where people have gone when they are hospitalized?
That's what you need to know. That's why as a community you need to plan. And you need to have your registry. You need to plan with your community. You need to register to whatever type of registry that they have. And if you have a good community emergency plan, someone in your community is going to be in charge of maybe knowing where you are, or maybe you are you're going to be in charge of communicating with whomever it is in charge, and that is a way of you to keeping track of your family, community, people. So it is all about planning with your community, registering with your community or agency. If you offer services for people with disabilities, you need to know where your people are. This is what MAVI did during Maria, because they have different offices all across the island, and they knew where their people were, or they knew where they lived, or they tried to communicate with them.
Yeah, and this is, and that's an excellent question, because this is precisely one of the biggest issues that tend to create or bring about that people with disabilities become institutionalized and stay institutionalized. Because during the chaos of the emergency and during the chaos of the evacuations, they're often shipped them on buses to different parts, and you don't know where they end up. So once this happens, it's very difficult, very hard to find out the information. So I think the focus should be on preventing this to actually happen. So for emergency responders, one of the key things is to remember, don't separate the person with disability from their family member. If you're going to evacuate them, you have to evacuate them together. If you create shelters, you have to ensure that they're sheltering next or with their family members or their service animals or their emotional support animals, because this is what is going to ensure the persons with disabilities' well-being in the aftermath of that evacuation. So that's an excellent question, and we need to work on the preventive aspect of that and not trying to figure out where they are after the disaster occurs.
Also, you need to when you plan with your community, even if you do your individual family emergency plan, you can also go to your emergency, your local emergency response office, and ask them, I live in this area, what are your plans for this area? This area floods, when will you be coming? Because our local emergency response office has their plan already. So it is also important for us as individuals to go and get that information and see how my planning can go hand in hand with the local emergency planning office.
Perfect, thank you. The next one is how do you inform people that have no computers or are technically challenged?
You use your news department. You make a collaborative agreement. You use your telephones with your WhatsApp applications. Most of the communication during a disaster usually won't go on through a computer. Most people will use their phones. And we're talking, for example, about the deaf population. They tend to use social media apps and their video relay systems, which they have already incorporated into their phones, those that are more young and more technologically advanced. So with the older population, using maybe these loudspeakers on cars going through the communities, warning or specifying what will happen, sharing shelter sites well in advance of disasters. Don't just start announcing shelters because hurricane season is coming along. Shelter locations should be made aware to community members well in advance of any disaster. So a continuous community education program which will give the people the information and they can store and have on hand and not have to wait for computer alerts or messages or news broadcasts, I think would be, again, the key is prevention. We have to try to plan so that we can better prevent and disasters or the casualties related to disasters.
Thank you. The next one is a comment followed by a question, okay? I am in the process of updating my agency's very outdated emergency preparedness plan. Is there somewhere where I can find a copy of an updated one to replicate for my agency?
A copy of an updated emergency plan.
Yeah.
Yes.
I can't tell you there's a site. I am not aware of a site where you can just find model emergency plans because each agency is so different. But if you want to contact us and if you want to send us maybe what you have, we can definitely provide you input on where we think you need to look at and where you could maybe things you should consider when updating it. So contact us. You have our agency's phone number and you have our email. Let us know what you have and we can definitely help you give suggestions on what you should be looking at and what you can do.
And the other important thing is that you have to participate in the other 2 workshops that we're giving on April. We will help you with the information that you need for the revision of your plan. So it is important for you to join us in April because you will have all the information that you need to update your plan.
Excellent point. And also, sorry.
Yeah, there is a question regarding the presentation. I think that the system still has the presentation that we had in Spanish. Yes, we have it in, yes.
Yeah,
it's
ready.
The PowerPoint is in English. It isn't in English.
It's there. Yes, it's there for them to download, also the English version. Also, a good recommendation is for them to contact their local emergency management office. Usually they have a link that has all the advice for people to do family emergency preparedness plan or businesses, etc. So excellent. The next question is, how do you recommend identifying them when the information is protected and the employee faces potential liability for asking? I don't know in what type of context that question comes up.
I think they are talking about the issue when you have a person with disability and you are planning for your agency maybe, and you don't know the disabilities of people with, and they don't want to identify as a person with disability. I think that's what they're talking about. That is why we need to plan broadly for all disabilities. We don't know when we are going to have one, when we are going to have a problem with mobility, when we are going to have a problem with going around, or someone has to help us because we had an accident or we had a surgery or something like that. So that is why we need to plan broadly. And if we plan broadly and accessible for everyone, we won't have major issues. We need to be aware that even people without a disability get stressed, get PTSD, get scared. So if it is a mental disability that is not visible, you need to plan for people that get stressed in a situation, not that have a disability. So it is a matter of, you probably don't need to ask if each and every one of your employees or the people that you work with have a disability. If you plan broadly, thinking about, do I have a chair to move people with disabilities from a high up floor? Do I have power or different types of settings for people with disabilities to know how to move around or where the exits are? So if we plan broadly, we don't need to ask. And if we just need to ask, we are making our emergency planning. Do you have a specific need that you need to be addressed in the emergency plan? And that is not something that violates their privacy or their medical information.
Thank you. One of our attendants also posts some links for the CPG 101 version 2 and also other links for those that are interested in updating their emergency plans. Next question. What legislative suggestions do you have to mandate effective registries?
To maintain an effective registry.
Sí. Yes.
I think that, and I can speak with regard to Puerto Rico. So I think legislation needs to go on at the state level, at the higher level, in order to mandate the lower levels, or in our case, municipal levels. I think the legislation should go in that direction, although if I say one thing, I'll say the other thing. We have a lot of municipalities here that have excellent registries, and they're updated, and they have managed to maintain them updated, which is the key towards the registry. So I think it's a question of looking within your state to see what's already available, what has worked, what needs to be maybe improved, and then build a comprehensive package that you can later on take to the state level so that they can then require lower levels to comply. But it's been a process where everyone has provided input to it. So maybe at the lower levels, they'll be more willing to accept this legislation and work with it and promote it and put it into action. So this requires discussion on a lot of levels, and more importantly, it requires discussion with the people with disabilities themselves. Oftentimes, legislation is created by a bunch of people that know nothing about the needs of people with disabilities. So when you're creating legislation, when you're providing recommendations, when you're creating protocols, you need to ensure that people with disabilities are there at the table, like Myrainne said. They need to be at the table telling you what they need, providing suggestions as to how it could go about, and eventually the municipal and government levels will decide how much money we have to be able to implement all of this. But it doesn't have to occur immediately. This can be a gradual planning process, but it has to go on. The discussions have to go on, and people with disabilities need to be at the table in the process.
Thank you. Please, people, stay connected. We have additional questions, and also we will place a pool of 3 questions that we would like you to answer for feedback on how we can do this type of webinars, to improve this type of webinars, okay? So the next question is, please provide suggestions for overcoming resistance to registration in special needs registries.
Suggestions? Can you repeat the question, Lourdes?
Yes.
I can find it.
Suggestions for overcoming resistance to registration in special needs registry. Too much R and S, but that is the question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the resistance of people with disabilities to register, to identify themselves as a person with a disability. I think that was the question. How to overcome that resistance.
So
Yes,
I think the first step would be to educate people with disabilities on why it's important for them to do it. It's not that I'm trying to invade your privacy. It's not that I'm trying to label you or identify you with a person with disability. The reason I'm asking for this information is because in the event of an emergency, we will try, because no emergency management agency can guarantee that a person with disability will be able to evacuate it or seen to in the course of the emergency, but we're going to put our best efforts into ensuring that you are protected. And the second way is that once the emergency management or municipal agencies get the information, they have to ensure the confidentiality of the information. Oftentimes, the resistance comes from being afraid of giving my information, because then I'll be labeled as someone that's vulnerable, someone that may not be able to fend for myself, and that can put you in a vulnerable situation on, in the society that we're living in right now. So I think the importance of this is to educate people with disabilities of the importance of the registry and ensure that that information is used for the purposes it was intended for, and that it's in a secure place, and that, third eyes that shouldn't have access to that information don't get the information. And actually proving with your actions that this registry works. So if in the event of the next disaster you actually use your registry and they see that they are being considered and looked at and helped during this process, I'm sure that in the future more people will be more willing to be part of that registry as well.
Mm-hmm.
Also, many comments have came out. People interested in the second part of this webinar. We have a site here in the chat where you can register to receive or to get subscribed for the webinar's announcement. However, we will sending emails to all the audience participated in the first part of the webinar with the notification when the second part will be scheduled. I don't have any other questions. What I have are more. Yeah.
Lourdes, maybe Betsy can put the information, the MAVI information, for people to contact them if they need any plan.
I already did. Myrainne.
Okay.
Yeah. The link is already there. Also, thank you very much for the great presentation you provide. We are looking for the next one, and the next one will be more than 1 hour. Will be approximately 2.5 hours, right?
Yes.
So, yes, I'll take that into consideration, and thank you, Betsy and Myrainne, for the great information provided. Also, for all that attend this morning webinar, were very communicative and also a good rapport, good questions, and thank you again.
Please complete the poll.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much for everyone that's here.